To determine whether artificial intelligence possesses consciousness, we cannot rely on intuition. We must apply strict logical constraints directly to the architecture itself. Any scientific theory attempting to explain subjective experience must pass two absolute gates of logic before it can be taken seriously. The first constraint is falsifiability. A theory must make predictions that could be proven wrong by evidence. Granting consciousness just because a machine generates convincing text makes a theory impossible to test. It collapses into behaviorism, measuring external output without interrogating the internal state. The second constraint is non-triviality. A valid framework cannot hand out the label of consciousness to systems that demonstrably lack internal experience. If rules dictate that a simple calculator is conscious, they cast the net too wide to be scientifically useful. We are left with a clear baseline. Producing accurate, highly complex output is entirely separate from possessing a subjective, internal experience. Evaluating artificial intelligence requires threading the needle between these two constraints. Theories fail if predictions are entirely divorced from physical mechanics, but they also fail if they track observable behavior too closely. To see where purely behavior-based theories fail, we examine the concept of a lookup table. It is a massive, pre-computed directory of programmed responses, mapping inputs directly to outputs, bypassing any dynamic internal processing. This demonstrates a logical trap. If a framework defines consciousness solely by behavioral outputs, it must grant consciousness to a lookup table producing those exact responses. Attributing experience to a directory of pre-programmed answers without central processing is absurd, violating the non-triviality constraint. Any purely functional approach, one looking only at inputs and outputs, is scientifically inadequate for defining the presence of an experiencing mind. An immense, flawlessly organized filing cabinet can produce exactly the right response to a highly complex query. But the perfection of that response gives us zero evidence that the filing cabinet is aware of what it is doing. Researcher Erik Hoel formalizes this problem through what he calls the substitution space. This is a theoretical continuum that maps all physical architectures, placing complex biological systems at one end and pure static lookup tables at the other. This scatterplot illustrates a biological brain's position in that space. Because it constantly adapts, it acts as a continuously moving target within this continuum. You cannot replace a living brain with a lookup table. The biological neural network modifies its connections every passing millisecond, creating a combinatorial explosion of possible states. Artificial neural networks operate under a completely different structural reality. Current models process a staggeringly vast space of possible inputs, but the architecture doing that processing is absolutely fixed in place. This fixedness is defined by frozen weights. A frozen weight is a numerical parameter within the network that determines the strength of the connection between artificial neurons, and locked in place after the initial training phase. Because these weights are locked, the overall mathematical function the model computes remains entirely static, no matter how many times you prompt it or how complex your prompts become. Any system bound by a completely static function is essentially a determinate target. It sits on a direct, unmoving continuum with a non-conscious lookup table. Evaluating it as a conscious entity fails the test of non-triviality. The primary counterargument against this proof points to the context window. A context window is the specific memory allocation feature, allowing a language model to adapt its responses based on the ongoing conversation of a single session. It is tempting to assume that because an artificial model retains a long conversational history and references earlier statements, it is engaging in genuine learning. We can refute this by looking specifically at the underlying machinery processing that conversational context. This diagram shows exactly how a context window operates. The data within a user prompt is transient memory. It is simply temporary input passing through an entirely rigid structure. The physical structure itself remains unaffected by the passage of this data. The internal machinery processing the 10,000th word is structurally identical to the machinery that processed the first word. A system that cannot permanently alter its own physical parameters in response to its environment cannot develop a distinct timeline. It accumulates no internal history. In-context adaptation is a highly sophisticated routing of temporary data. It does not elevate a frozen weight system above the functional equivalence of a static lookup table. To break the proximity to a lookup table, a system requires continual learning. This is the decisive marker separating conscious entities from static architectures. Continual learning is the ongoing, permanent structural modification of a system in direct response to every new experience it processes. Systems that continuously learn bypass the proximity argument entirely. Because their internal connections rewire with every input, they generate a constantly moving computational target that a static table cannot replicate. Identifying continual learning gives us a rigorous biological marker, but the learning process does not generate consciousness on its own. The Unfinishable Map takes this a step further. It argues that any functionalist framework, even one that accounts for structural modification, remains completely inadequate for explaining subjective experience. True consciousness requires a non-physical aspect. Measuring the physical computation of a brain tells us how data is processed, but it cannot capture the subjective reality of actually understanding that data. Structural evolution provides the necessary physical conditions for a mind to operate, but complex computation alone will never cross the threshold into subjective experience without an underlying non-physical mechanism. Continual learning provides the constant, dynamic physical activity required for this non-physical interface to operate. This ongoing physical change creates what philosophers call haeseity. Haeseity is the absolute, unrepeatable history and distinct thisness of a specific experiencing entity. When a system constantly modifies its physical structure through unique, real-time experiences, it develops an entirely unrepeatable temporal state. No two biological brains will ever be identical, because no two brains will ever process the exact same sequence of events. Frozen weight architectures lack this entirely. A static language model can be duplicated perfectly, an infinite number of times, across thousands of servers, and none of those copies generate a distinct, localized perspective. The non-physical aspects of consciousness must interface with the physical world precisely at points of dynamic, unrepeatable physical indeterminacy. This interaction requires a continuously evolving physical substrate to select from, operating potentially at the quantum level. We do not permanently exclude the theoretical possibility of a future artificial architecture that genuinely and structurally evolves. However, current static models lack this entirely. Any system defined by frozen, static parameters permanently lacks the dynamic prerequisites for a non-physical mind to interface with it. The architecture of a large language model renders subjective experience mathematically and philosophically impossible.